Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa, and today I'm showing you how to make a smocked sundress for a doll. Now I'm demonstrating on a Barbie doll today, but you could probably do this on any similar type of fashion doll. I will be giving the specific measurements for the Barbie doll, but I will also be showing how I got those measurements. So if you are doing it for a different doll, you should be able to recreate it. This is a great project if you are a beginner and new to smocking, because it's pretty small in that you can pleat it easily by yourself without needing a smocking pleater, and fairly straightforward. There's not a lot of difficult techniques to it. That said, I am not going but so deep into some of these steps that are required for smocking. Most of these steps I did cover in my introduction to smocking video, which I will link in the description. And so if there's anything that's not explained in detail here, it's probably in that video. To start out, you're going to cut a rectangle of fabric. And to determine this, the size of it, you're going to take your doll and you are going to measure around the bust of the doll. So in the case of a original body Barbie, that's approximately 5 inches, and it is okay to round down if you need to. So take that number, in this case 5 inches, and multiply it by 3, and that gets me 15 inches, which is the width of my piece of fabric here. For the length, this is dependent on the size of the the length that you want. So I would just measure from under the doll's arm down to wherever you want it to fall, and then add your seam allowance, which I would recommend 1/2 inch. That allows for a 1/4 inch at the top and a 1/4 inch at the bottom. And in my case, that is a 6-inch tall piece. Next, I'm going to go ahead and hem the top and bottom of this rectangle. Now, for the bottom, you can hem it just however you typically would finish the hem of any dress or skirt that you would make. In my case, I usually serge it and then just fold it up and stitch it down with the machine. For the top edge, I find that doing that creates too bulky of an edge. And so what I prefer to do for that is to fold it over twice, as narrow as possible, like 1/8 of an inch if possible, and just hand sew it. So after your fabric is hemmed on both ends, it's time to figure out how many rows of smocking you're going to do. To do this, I take the doll and measure from above the bust down to the waist. On this doll, that's about 1 3/4 inches. So for me, I'm using a smocking pleater, and all I'm doing is I'm just measuring on the pleater from the needles to the one that is closest to 1 3/4 inches. For me, that's 5 rows. I could round it up to 6, but I'm not going to. If you're trying to figure this out on your own and you're not sure, like if you're doing a different size, I would say go ahead and round up, and if you don't need it, it can be a holding row, and if you need it, it's already pleated. Now obviously this is very easy if you have a smocking pleater to figure, because you are just measuring on the grids. But if you are hand pleating, first off, you can do that if you don't have a pleater, and I have a video about as an introduction to smocking, and it does include how to pleat by hand, so I would encourage you to go look at that. I'll link it in the description. But what I would do if I was hand pleating this is I would go ahead and measure from right underneath this hemline down 1 3/4 inches. And then I would go ahead and mark my dots for pleating. So what you do when you hand pleat is you mark dots 1/4 inch apart going this way, and 3/4 inches, and in rows that are 3/4 inches, or 3/8 of an inch apart this way. And so what I would do is I would just go ahead and mark from here my rows. So I would mark at 3/8 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, and so on all the way down until I got to that 1 3/4 inches or a little past it. And then I would proceed to mark the rest of the dots like I would for any other hand pleating. And as I said, there is a more detailed explanation of hand pleating in my introduction to smocking video. So I have my pleater threaded and ready to go, and I'm just going to show you how I run this through. This is a bit different than what you would typically do for smocking, in that I am not doing holding rows, which is typically you would pleat an extra row both above and below your work to help make it easier. I'm not doing that. I am also, basically because of the scale of this, so it's so small that it's very hard to do that. I am also not leaving a lot of room between the top of the fabric and my first pleating row. So normally you'd almost have like 3/8 of an inch between that top pleating row and your work. In this case, I am trying, and not succeeding very well, to get my first pleating row as close to the bottom of my top hem as possible. And this is just because of the nature of how I'm doing this. The closer it is to the top for that first row, the better. Alright, I finally got it hooked in there correctly. And like I said, you can do this by hand, and your first row actually would be much easier to set because you could mark it right underneath the hem very easily and then just keep measuring down. So next up is what's called blocking your fabric, and that's just pulling the piece of fabric to a certain width and tying it off. So to determine that width for this project, you're going to go back to your doll and you're going to measure around her waist. And then you're going to add seam allowance. So for mine, it's a little less than 3.5 inches, and I just add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to that. Oh, yeah, a little less than 3.5 inches. So I round down to 3.25 inches because this style dress is going to stretch. So a little small is not a bad thing in this case. So basically 3.25 inches is what I'm considering my waist measurement, and then I add a 1/2 inch for seam allowance, bringing me up to 3 3/4 inches, and that is what I'm going to block my fabric to. After the fabric is tied off to the correct width, just spread out and even out those pleats, and I always run some steam over it to hold them in place. Once the fabric has dried and cooled off, it's then time to smock. Alright, here we are ready to start smocking. Now, I don't do any kind of intricate design with this. It's so small that I don't consider it worth it. I just do a simple cable stitch in whatever colors I feel like doing across the entire piece, 1 row per pleating line. And one thing to note with this is normally in smocking you would have a holding row above and below your smocking line. That just helps to hold your pleats in place, or like give you a guide. Means that the pleats you're working on are a whole lot neater. I don't do that with this. With the top, it's not possible. There's no room to have a pleating row or a holding row at the top. And with the bottom, I just figure, well, if I manage to do it without the holding row at the top, I can do it at the bottom. Now, if you have trouble telling what's going on with these pleats on the top row, because like I said, the top and bottom rows do tend to be a little kind of uneven and not very neat, especially the top row, really. What you could do is you could start with the second row and pleat it first, smock it first, and then it would help because you would have a guide of sorts. You could follow what you did on the row below to see where you are in your smocking at the top. So now all of the smocking on the front is done. And for this, I'm going to do another step, which is called back smocking. Now, normally this is done if you have like big gaps of space between your rows and you want to hold your pleats in place. In my case, I'm doing it because I find that back smocking on the top and bottom rows only helps to not eliminate necessarily, but minimize, you could say, wardrobe malfunctions. I found that if I don't do this, the top of the dress is much more likely to slip off when in use. So basically what back smocking is taking a similar color thread to your fabric and, like it says, smocking on the back, usually just a cable stitch. And you're not going as deep into the pleats because you don't want it to really be visible on the front. So you want to take very shallow stitches if possible. In my case, I'm just using a light blue and slowly making my way across the bottom row, and then I will go up and do the same for the top. Once the smocking is done, it's back to the ironing board to steam the piece again, which locks in these stitches. Now that the fabric has cooled and sat for a while, I am just going to clip these knots and remove them. And now you can see how it kind of stretches a little. Don't pull on it too much. You don't want to pull it out too much, stretch out. But now we're just going to fold it right sides together and stitch down this back seam. Turn the outfit right side out. And put it on the doll. This does have a few different variations to it. If you wanted to make this as a shirt instead of a dress, all you have to do is shorten it. And if you don't like the distance between the rows of smocking, you can actually smock a second row right in between each of the pleated rows. Thank you so much for watching. If you try this out, let me know in the comments, and if you have any questions, you can leave them there and I will do my best to answer them.